Some crimes wear their disguise not in darkness, but in colour. It begins with a widow in an elegant green gown who claims to be hunted by a faceless intruder, while Holmes suspects that the greatest danger lies within her own heart. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk together into the chambers of Baker Street, where deduction will strip every veil from deceit. It was upon a singularly tranquil evening in Baker Street that this history first unfolded, one of those rare hours when the pulse of London seemed to beat more softly, and Holmes himself lay inclined to quiet reflection rather than to action. The fire burned low upon the hearth, casting a mellow glow across the familiar outlines of our sitting room, while outside the muffled sound of wheels upon the wet pavement alone disturbed the stillness. My companion, stretched at length in his armchair, gave no sign of wakeful thought save the intermittent glow of his cigarette. For my own part, I had taken up a medical journal, but the serenity of the night lulled me into a state of reverie, wherein the events of the past months drifted vaguely across my mind. It was in such moments that I often realized the extraordinary contrast between the tumultuous adventures into which Holmes's genius continually drew me, and the rare but precious silences which intervened. Yet, as experience had long taught me, such calm seldom endured in his presence. Even as I mused upon the quietude, I observed that peculiar brightness in his eye, which presaged the advent of some small but telling incident. "My dear Watson," said Holmes suddenly, rising from his chair with that alertness which transformed his whole bearing, "you appear to have overlooked a small token that has been presented at our very threshold." Crossing the room with his long stride, he drew from the mantelpiece a narrow strip of silk, a ribbon of dark green hue, somewhat frayed at the edges, yet evidently of costly weave. It was placed, as you may observe, just inside the door. Mrs. Hudson, with her habitual discretion, left it for my notice. I rose, somewhat incredulous, and examined the article. To me it seemed no more than a fragment discarded by chance, yet I knew too well the folly of dismissing what Holmes deemed worthy of attention. He turned the ribbon over in his long fingers, scrutinizing it with the same intensity he might bestow upon a blood-stained dagger. "Observe the faint perfume upon the fabric, Watson, distinctly foreign, with a tincture of jasmine. The edges are worn, not by long use, but by the nervous clutching of a hand. The knot was once drawn tightly, suggesting it adorned the waist rather than the hair. Lastly, note the fleck of damp earth adhering to it. It was dropped outside in haste this very evening." I could not withhold my admiration. What I had taken for mere refuse, Holmes had transmuted into a chain of circumstance as vivid as though he had witnessed its fall. "You perceive, Watson," Holmes continued, "the entire history contained within so slight a thing. To the untrained eye, a ribbon is but a ribbon. To the practiced observer, it is an epistle in cloth." He spoke with that quiet authority which never failed to impress upon me the gulf between his vision and my own. I protested, perhaps more warmly than was reasonable, that such deductions could not be demanded of the ordinary mind. He smiled, with that touch of irony which so often accompanied his instruction. "It is not genius that is required, but method," he replied. "The world is full of trifles. Few men have trained themselves to see, and fewer still to reason upon what they see. You, for instance, remarked its colour, but not its scent. You noted its fabric, yet ignored its condition. Each omission is but a link dropped from the chain, and the chain itself thus fails to bear weight." His words, though gently spoken, pricked my pride, yet I could not deny their truth. In that moment, I felt once more the peculiar mixture of humility and wonder which his companionship so often inspired. Holmes had scarcely replaced the ribbon upon the mantel when there came a sudden rap at the door below, firm, hurried, and with that peculiar insistence which speaks of urgent need. The sound reverberated through the quiet house, startling even Mrs. Hudson, who hastened up the stair with anxious countenance. "A visitor at this hour," I remarked, for the clock had already struck 9. Holmes merely inclined his head, his eyes narrowing with the anticipation of some fresh problem. Mrs. Hudson entered, her manner betraying unease. "There is a lady below, sir," she announced. "She is most desirous of seeing you at once. She would not give her name, but insists that her business will not bear delay." Holmes rose without haste, though I could see the keen interest quickening in his features. "Pray show her in, Mrs. Hudson," said he. A moment later, the door opened, and there entered a figure whose aspect at once arrested my attention. She was of slender build, attired in a gown of deep green satin, which, though elegant, struck me as singularly ill-chosen for one in mourning. Her veil was lifted, revealing a face of pallor so marked that it seemed almost luminous in the lamplight. The eyes, large and sombre, were rimmed with fatigue, and the hand which clasped the door trembled visibly. She advanced a step, then halted as though her strength might fail her. Holmes, with his habitual courtesy, indicated a chair and waited until she had sunk into it. For some moments she seemed unable to speak, but sat gazing at us with a mingling of apprehension and appeal. At last, in a low and quavering voice, she said, "Mr. Holmes, I come to you in my hour of greatest need. My name is Eleanor Harcourt. I am a widow, and I believe myself pursued by a danger which I scarcely comprehend." The tremor in her tone, joined with the sombre beauty of her attire, lent to her words a weight that instantly dispelled all sense of triviality. As Mrs. Hudson withdrew, the lady remained for an instant upon the threshold, her gloved hand trembling upon the latch as though the simple act of entering demanded all her strength. I could not but note the incongruity of her attire. That gown of lustrous green satin, so singular in hue, clung about her like some strange emblem that jarred with the conventional sombre garb of widowhood. A jet brooch at her breast and a modest veil thrown back from her face alone hinted at mourning. Yet the pallor of her features bore testimony to grief more eloquent than any costume. Her fingers twisted nervously together as she glanced first at Holmes, then at myself, as though weighing whether she might trust the men before her. The faintest shiver passed across her shoulders, and I saw that her lips moved silently before she found words. It seemed to me in that moment that we looked not upon a suppliant merely, but upon a soul at war with hidden terrors, restrained by the fragile thread of pride. Holmes, perceiving her hesitation, inclined his head gravely, and with that small act of courtesy, drew her across the threshold into our confidence. "My name," she began, her voice low and uneven, "is Eleanor Harcourt. I fear that by venturing here I have placed myself in greater peril, yet I could no longer endure my solitude." The words fell from her lips with a dignity that seemed hard won, for her hands shook and the faint quaver of her tone betrayed the storm beneath her composure. Holmes, who had resumed his seat, regarded her with eyes half closed, his fingers steepled before him. "You need not fear candour here, madam," said he in that calm manner which carried assurance more surely than protestations. She drew a deep breath, as if to steel herself. "Since the death of my husband, a month past, I have known neither rest nor peace. Strange warnings, sinister hints, and unseen watchfulness haunt me at every hour. At first I dismissed them as delusions of grief, but they have grown in persistence until I can no longer doubt some malignant intelligence pursues me." As she spoke, I was struck by the mingling of resolution and fear in her aspect. Hers was no common petitioner for legal redress or lost property. Here was a woman harried by forces of secrecy, clinging to composure as a drowning soul clings to a spar. Holmes inclined his head a fraction, inviting her to proceed without the pressure of interrogation, and thus her tale unfolded. "My husband, Henry Harcourt," she continued, "was seized most suddenly. He had been, to my knowledge, in vigorous health. One evening he complained of a heaviness of the chest, and before dawn he was no more." She paused, her eyes fixed upon the carpet, as though reluctant to meet ours. She spoke of physicians summoned too late, of neighbours murmuring condolences, yet with every phrase there fell a hesitation, a faltering pause which suggested more lay beneath than was uttered. Holmes, attentive to every nuance, leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "There was no suspicion raised?" he asked quietly. "None," she replied swiftly, almost too swiftly. "The verdict was natural causes, and yet—" She checked herself suddenly, her hands tightening upon her lap. "And yet?" Holmes prompted, but she only shook her head. To my own mind there seemed some weight unspoken, some hidden dread bound up with her husband's end. That shadow lent a new gravity to her words, and I found myself awaiting what next disclosure might emerge with breathless anticipation. "It began," she said, "with slips of paper thrust beneath my door at night, or placed upon the hall table when no servant could claim to have delivered them. The first bore but a single word. 'Beware.' The second added, 'You are watched.' Each thereafter hinted that my late husband's affairs concealed a danger which would soon overtake me. The hand was disguised, the letters cut with deliberate strokes that denied recognition. Yet there was in them a force which froze my blood." As she recounted these nocturnal visitations, her voice dropped almost to a whisper, and I felt the chill of her apprehension, as though some shadow crept across our own hearth. "Have you preserved these notes?" Holmes inquired. "One only, Mr. Holmes. The rest I destroyed in a fit of terror, but the threats continue." She reached into a reticule and produced a slip of paper, which Holmes took delicately between his fingers. I observed his brow furrow as he examined it, though he made no comment. The widow's hands, folded tightly in her lap, betrayed how near she was to the limits of her endurance. "Nor were the notes the only tokens," she resumed hurriedly, as if compelled to lay bare the full extent of her dread. "Windows which I know I had fastened were found unlatched in the morning. Small objects vanished, only to reappear in strange places, and more than once I have heard stealthy footsteps outside my chamber door when all the household slept. My servants whisper of lights seen in the orchard at night, though no intruder has been caught." As she spoke, I felt a keen unease, for there was in her recital that mingling of the ordinary with the sinister which renders the commonplace suddenly formidable. Holmes alone remained impassive, his gaze fixed not upon her face, but upon the restless movements of her hands, as though in them he read some tale yet unspoken. At this point, her composure, which she had husbanded with such effort, seemed to falter. She clasped her gloved hands tightly together and leaned forward. "I believe," she said in a strained voice, "that these persecutions are aimed at compelling me to reveal something which I do not possess, or to confess to some secret I cannot fathom. There are affairs of my husband's past life into which he never permitted me to inquire. I fear that the mystery which surrounded him has survived his death and now threatens to engulf me." The intensity of her tone, joined to the pallor of her cheek, impressed me deeply. It was as though she stood at the brink of some hidden chasm, uncertain whether silence or speech would bring her ruin. Holmes regarded her with grave composure. "You are convinced then, madam, that some disclosure, known only to your husband, is the key to these attacks?" She bowed her head, but offered no further detail. The silence which followed was more eloquent than words, and I could not doubt that she concealed more than she had revealed. For some moments after her last words, Holmes remained perfectly still, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon her with an intensity which seemed to pierce every veil of concealment. The widow, abashed by that searching gaze, shifted uneasily in her chair and turned her eyes to the fire. At length he spoke, his tone quiet but deliberate. "You wear, madam, a gown of unusual shade for one in mourning. May I ask whether it was chosen by design?" She started visibly, her lips parting, yet she replied with studied calm, that it was an old favourite, worn without thought. Holmes inclined his head, but said no more. He then inquired after the disposition of her household, the loyalty of her servants, and the habits of her late husband. To each she gave answers that were fluent, yet curiously guarded. When at last she fell silent, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fastened upon her with that inscrutable expression which to me bespoke both interest and suspicion. I knew then that he had already perceived some thread invisible to others, and that this strange widow in green had brought us a problem worthy of his powers. 2 mornings later we quitted London in the company of our singular client. The autumnal mist hung low upon the fields as the train carried us swiftly into the quiet reaches of Surrey, leaving behind the clamour of the city. Mrs. Harcourt sat opposite, her veil lowered, her hands clasped tightly upon her lap, speaking little save in brief replies to Holmes's courteous questions. For his part, my friend appeared unusually abstracted, gazing through the carriage window with that inward look which bespoke the steady turning of his mental machinery. I confess that my own spirits were less composed. The lady's manifest distress, joined with the strangeness of the circumstances she had outlined, impressed upon me a sense of approaching calamity. There was in her attitude a mixture of defiance and dread, which I could not wholly reconcile. Holmes broke his silence only once, remarking in his dry fashion that the country air may prove more revealing than London walls. Thereafter, he relapsed into thought, and I was left to watch the grey hedgerows slip by until at length the train slowed, and the station nearest to Harcourt Grange came into view. A carriage awaited us, and in less than half an hour we had reached the estate. Harcourt Grange, as it was styled, stood in sombre dignity upon a gentle rise, its gables and mullioned windows lending it an air of antiquity. Yet the very aspect of the place was melancholy. Ivy clung thickly to its walls, the lawns were neglected, and a certain air of disuse hung about the deserted corners of the garden. The widow's unease was reflected in the house itself. The shutters of the eastern wing remained drawn, and the gravel of the drive bore no marks of cheerful visitors. It seemed to me as though we entered not a home, but a dwelling steeped in apprehension. Holmes, however, regarded it all with his keen, penetrating gaze. He observed the angle of the chimneys, the depth of the ruts upon the carriage road, and even the pattern of fallen leaves upon the path. "Decay, Watson," he murmured, "is seldom confined to mortar and stone. It creeps where human vigilance has faltered." With that, he followed Mrs. Harcourt into the hall, his every movement betraying that he was already upon the scent of some hidden clue. Our first inspection was directed to the exterior of Mrs. Harcourt's chamber, where she averred that the mysterious disturbances most often occurred. The ground was soft from recent rains, and it was Holmes who first stooped to examine a series of impressions plainly visible in the soil beneath the window. "They are not of the gardener's boot," said he at once. "Note the narrow sole, the pointed toe, and the uneven pressure upon the instep. A man of middle height, weight not exceeding 11 stone, and with a slight infirmity of the left foot." I bent low, marvelling at the clarity with which he discerned such particulars. To me they were but formless patches upon the earth, yet to him they spoke as plainly as a printed page. Mrs. Harcourt, pale and anxious, drew back as if fearful that the prints themselves might conceal some sinister intelligence. Holmes, however, was unmoved. He measured their distance with his gaze, traced the line of approach across the sodden grass, and rose with a grim smile. "Our visitor," he said, "has been both bold and deliberate. He comes not as a prowler, but with the assurance of one who knows his ground." From the chamber window, we passed into the garden itself, where an object arrested our attention at once. Tied with careful precision about the gnomon of an ancient sundial was a narrow ribbon of green silk, its colour vivid against the weathered stone. Mrs. Harcourt uttered a faint cry and would have seized it, but Holmes restrained her. "Pray, allow me," said he, removing it delicately. "It is freshly tied, the knot still firm, the fabric unfrayed. Our adversary plays not merely to frighten, but to proclaim his presence with audacity. I confess the sight of that ribbon stirred in me a sense of the macabre, as though the intruder mocked us openly in the daylight. The widow, trembling, pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Holmes examined the knot minutely, noting a twist peculiar to seamen, then slipped the token into his pocket. "It is not the article itself which is eloquent, but the hand which placed it," he remarked. His composure did much to steady my own nerves, though I could not escape the conviction that we stood within the shadow of some unseen menace. Upon our return indoors, I found myself in the vicinity of the kitchens, where the low murmur of voices reached my ear. The servants, gathered in a knot, spoke with that hushed intensity which springs from fear. I caught phrases of "the orchard at dusk" and "a man among the trees," uttered with a tremor which betrayed genuine alarm. When they perceived my presence, they fell silent, each affecting some trivial task, yet their glances betrayed the persistence of the rumour. I did not intrude further, but the impression left upon my mind was of a household already half conquered by apprehension. Holmes, when I related it, merely inclined his head, observing that rumour, like smoke, often betrays the fire beneath. He, however, chose not to linger among their whispers, but to pursue his inquiries in his own deliberate fashion. Holmes requested that the principal servants attend him in the library, where he subjected them to a quiet yet searching scrutiny. His questions, though framed with courtesy, probed with relentless accuracy into their habits, movements, and knowledge of the late master's affairs. I was struck by the unease his presence provoked. Some answered fluently, others hesitated, yet in every reply there seemed a shadow of evasion, as though each feared to disclose too much. Holmes noted every pause, every contradiction, with that inward light in his eyes which told me he stored the details for later use. When the interview ended, he said nothing of his conclusions, yet I could perceive from the tightening of his lips that he was dissatisfied. "There is truth here, Watson," he murmured, "but it lies buried beneath a cloak of silence." It was later that afternoon that the name of the dismissed gardener first arose. He had, we learned, served the Harcourt family faithfully for many years, until some dispute with the late master occasioned his abrupt dismissal. Since then, he had been seen loitering upon the outskirts of the estate, and it was whispered that his temper, once mild, had soured into bitterness. Holmes seized upon the circumstance with evident interest. A man familiar with the grounds, embittered by grievance, and possessing the leisure of idleness, surely no figure could better suit our visitor. Mrs. Harcourt herself appeared disturbed at the mention, confessing that she had once trusted him implicitly, but now dreaded his lingering presence near the property. For my part, I felt the case incline heavily in this direction. Yet Holmes, though he remarked upon the strength of the suspicion, offered no final word. His silence, I knew, was ever the herald of deeper thought. That same evening, a cry from one of the maids brought us hastily to the entrance hall, where a scene both startling and sinister awaited us. Pinned fast to the stout oak of the front door by the thrust of a long-bladed kitchen knife was a folded slip of paper, the edges quivering still with the recent blow. Upon it, scrawled in bold, uneven letters, was a single word: green. The effect upon the household was electric. The servants gathered in a frightened knot, whispering wildly, while Mrs. Harcourt, pale as the marble floor beneath her, clutched at the banister for support. To my own mind, the audacity of the act was scarcely less terrifying than its menace. That some intruder should venture to the very portal of the house, in the heart of evening, and there plant so insolent a token, argued a reckless boldness which boded ill for our client's safety. Holmes alone appeared unmoved. With a gesture, he silenced the rising tumult, drew out the knife with a firm hand, and regarded both blade and missive with that cool precision which transformed danger itself into a mere specimen for analysis. At sight of the hateful word, Mrs. Harcourt's composure gave way. With a faint gasp, she reeled against the wall, her hands pressed to her breast, and but for my timely arm she would have fallen senseless. I led her to a chair, where she sank trembling, her lips moving in broken utterances of dread. It was not in me to remain indifferent to such anguish. The contrast between her proud bearing and her present helplessness stirred in me a deep compassion. I spoke such words of reassurance as I could command, assuring her that while Holmes remained by her side, no danger could touch her. She clung to my hand as though it were the last barrier between herself and some advancing horror. Holmes, for his part, neither rebuked my warmth nor encouraged it. He regarded her with that grave courtesy which cloaked his penetrating scrutiny, and when at last her breathing steadied, he bade me leave her side that he might pursue his examination. Yet the image of her stricken countenance lingered with me, awakening that instinct of protectiveness which I could not suppress. Holmes spread the slip of paper upon the hall table, examining its characters with deliberate care. He traced the strokes with a slender forefinger, pausing to note the angle of each line. The hand is disguised, yet betrays a firmness not often found in the uneducated, he remarked calmly. Observe the blunt termination of the pen, Watson, and the pressure here and here. Our correspondent writes habitually with freedom, but has sought to alter his natural character. Such concealment, however, is never perfect. He next considered the knife, turning it over as though it were but an insect pinned for study. From the scullery, I surmise, said he. Its absence will not pass unmarked. The widow, though still shaken, gazed at him with a mixture of fear and wonder, as though his composure itself were a talisman against the unseen peril. When calm was in some measure restored, Holmes seated himself opposite our client, and with grave courtesy requested that she enlighten him further concerning her late husband's affairs. It is only by clear knowledge of the past, said he, that we may arm ourselves against the menace of the present. At first she answered freely enough. Of his business connections, his travels, his friendships. Yet when the subject turned, however delicately, to financial matters, I observed at once a change. She faltered, evaded, and grew strangely absorbed in the adjustment of her gloves. To Holmes' most straightforward questions, she offered replies that were vague, if not contradictory. Your husband, I believe, was a man of considerable estate, Holmes suggested. She coloured faintly and replied that his affairs were adequate, then quickly diverted the talk to trivial domestic concerns. Holmes asked no more, but I could read in the tightening of his lips that her reticence had not escaped him. As for myself, I felt a stir of perplexity. Was her silence born of ignorance, or of some deliberate concealment? Later that afternoon, I found myself walking with Mrs. Harcourt through the neglected gardens. The air was heavy with damp, and the last leaves of autumn drifted about our feet. She moved with quick, nervous steps, her eyes glancing continually behind her, as though she half expected some lurking figure to emerge from the shrubberies. Do you never feel safe here? I asked gently. Never, she whispered. By day I am watched, by night pursued. Even in sleep I cannot escape the sense of hostile eyes upon me. Her words, though uttered softly, carried the ring of truth, and I could not but feel pity for her. Yet in her agitation there was also that curious restraint which seemed to hint at deeper causes than she was prepared to confess. The impression haunted me as we turned back towards the house. That evening, as we sat together in the library, Holmes spoke to me in a tone so low that it could not carry beyond the circle of lamplight. Watson, said he, Our Lady's tale is remarkable less for what it discloses than for what it omits. Each answer she has given is hedged about with silence. It is as if she walks continually upon the brink of revelation, yet dares not take the final step. I ventured to urge that her terror seemed genuine enough. Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. But fear, my dear fellow, is not always of the enemy without. There are occasions when it springs from the heart's own concealments. In this case, I suspect we see both forces at work. He would say no more, but I knew from the gleam in his eye that the web of his deductions was already spinning itself into form. The day closed with a silence so oppressive that even the whisper of the wind through the eaves seemed charged with menace. The household moved softly, as though fearful of awakening some hidden presence. The servants exchanged anxious looks, and Mrs. Harcourt sat long before the fire, her face pale and set, her thoughts locked within. For my own part, I felt the atmosphere weigh heavily upon me. It was as though a storm gathered invisibly above the house, its first mutterings already heard in the strange incidents which had thickened around us. Holmes alone betrayed no change. He sat in his accustomed chair, his long fingers drumming lightly upon the arm, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize that behind that calm exterior his mind was working with all the intensity of a general preparing for battle. That night, the heavens seemed in league with the sinister forces arrayed against us. A gale rose with sudden fury, driving torrents of rain against the windows and rattling the casements as though some furious hand sought entrance. The trees groaned and bent before the blast, their boughs lashing the air like whips, while the moan of the wind through the chimneys filled the house with ghostly lamentations. I confess the storm weighed heavily upon my spirits. The isolation of the estate, set amid wide stretches of darkened woodland, seemed doubly oppressive under such elemental tumult. Even the stout walls of Harcourt Grange appeared but a frail defence against the violence without. Holmes, however, remained composed, seated in his accustomed posture, with eyes half closed, as if the roar of nature were but an idle accompaniment to his thoughts. Yet for all his calm, I could not rid myself of the conviction that the tempest was but a prelude to some darker eruption within. It was near midnight when a cry, shrill and piercing, rang through the corridors, cutting above the din of storm like the scream of a lost soul. In an instant, the household was aroused, doors flung open, and hurried feet echoed along the passage. It was from Mrs. Harcourt's chamber that the cry had issued, and thither we hastened with all speed. We found her standing rigid by the window, her face blanched with horror, her arm extended toward the rain-smeared panes. "There!" she gasped. "At the casement, a man, masked and clad in green." She sank into a chair, trembling so violently that her words were almost lost. The curtains stirred with the draught of the storm, but of any intruder there was no trace. Yet her terror was such that even I, sceptical by nature, felt a chill, as though some unholy presence had indeed looked in upon us. Holmes, calm as ever, drew the curtains and examined the sill with keen eyes. "Watson," said he quietly, "perhaps you would accompany me into the grounds." Snatching a lantern, I plunged into the storm at Holmes's side. The rain beat upon us mercilessly, drenching cloak and hair, while the wind near tore the light from my grasp. Across the sodden lawn we ran, Holmes guiding unerringly to the spot beneath the lady's window. There, sure enough, the ground bore signs of disturbance, deep impressions where feet had pressed into the softened earth. Beyond, a trail of trampled grass led toward the orchard. With beating heart I followed, the lantern casting fitful gleams upon the dripping branches. Once I fancied I saw a shadow flit among the trees, and I gave chase with all the vigour at my command. Yet when I reached the spot, there was nothing save the sway of boughs in the gale and the hiss of rain through the leaves. I shouted, but only the storm answered. Holmes rejoined me, his expression unreadable. He bent low, examining the grass, then straightened with a grave shake of the head. "Our quarry, if such there was, is gone," said he. And with that we retraced our steps, the futility of the pursuit weighing upon me like lead. Meanwhile, within the house confusion reigned. The servants, pale and whispering, huddled in frightened groups. Each claimed to have heard stealthy movements or glimpsed shadows passing along the corridors. The storm, magnifying every sound, played cruel tricks upon their overwrought senses. Some were convinced the intruder had long known the ways of the estate, slipping unseen where honest folk dared not tread. Others whispered darkly of retribution from the grave, pointing to the suddenness of the late master's death. Mrs. Harcourt, near fainting, clung to her maid, while her eyes darted continually toward the door, as though she expected it to yield once more. Holmes entered among them, his calm presence acting as a tonic upon the tumult, though I observed he offered no word of reassurance beyond the most formal courtesies. It was in the course of restoring order that a fresh discovery redoubled the general alarm. The housekeeper, entering the late Mr. Harcourt's study, uttered an exclamation which brought us all to the spot. The cabinet, wherein were kept certain valuables of the family, stood open, and from it the most prized heirloom was gone, a pendant of carved jade, the gift of an Eastern prince, and an object of both rarity and considerable worth. Mrs. Harcourt, on learning of the loss, gave a cry scarcely less anguished than before. "It was his dearest possession," she wailed. "He valued it above all else. To lose it thus, it is as if his very memory were profaned." To my mind, the theft furnished incontestable proof that the masked figure was no phantom, but a villain of flesh and blood. Yet Holmes examined the lock, the hinges, and even the carpet with that slow, deliberate scrutiny which betrayed no haste to embrace the obvious. His silence was more significant than any declaration. By dawn the storm had abated, but the shadow it cast lingered heavily upon the house. To every appearance the facts pointed to a daring intruder who had not only terrified the mistress, but plundered her most cherished possession. The servants whispered of pursuit and punishment, and Mrs. Harcourt herself clung to the conviction that her phantom persecutor had at last revealed his hand. Holmes alone remained unmoved. He made no denial of the apparent case, yet his lips curved in that faint smile which I had come to recognize as the herald of deeper knowledge. He spoke little, merely remarking, "Appearances, Watson, are the most treacherous of witnesses." I could not divine his meaning, but I knew enough of his methods to await in patience the moment when the truth, long hidden, would be drawn forth by the relentless logic of his mind. The events of that storm-tossed night left the household in a state of subdued alarm, yet to Holmes it seemed rather the sharpening of a blade long prepared. On the following morning, I found him seated by the window, his gaze fixed not upon the autumn fields without, but upon the inner chambers of his mind. His fingers tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair, and his lips moved soundlessly, as though rehearsing the links of a chain whose form was now complete. I ventured to disturb his reverie with a question, but he merely raised a hand for silence. For nearly an hour he remained thus, until at last he sprang to his feet with the vigour of one who has reached decision. "Watson," said he, "the time has come for resolution. Our adversary has played boldly, but a single move more will suffice to force the checkmate. We must employ not pursuit, but strategy." There was in his tone that cool assurance which I had learned to recognize as the herald of success. Yet, though I pressed him for details, he offered none, but instead instructed me to make myself ready for a gathering that evening. After breakfast, Holmes summoned Mrs. Harcourt and informed her, in his most deliberate manner, that he desired every member of the household and such acquaintances as might be conveniently reached to assemble in the drawing-room at 8 o'clock. The lady, though visibly perplexed, raised no objection, but inclined her head with a weary resignation. Holmes's request was carried swiftly through the house. The servants, already unsettled by the terrors of the night, whispered uneasily among themselves at the summons. Yet none dared refuse. Even the butler, a man of stiff propriety, betrayed his apprehension by the nervous twirl of his keys. To me, the scheme appeared extraordinary. I questioned Holmes upon its necessity, but he only smiled. "When the tree bears poisoned fruit, Watson, one need only shake its trunk to see which bough is guilty." His words did little to enlighten me, but I could not miss the quiet certainty with which they were spoken. I began to realize that in his own mind the question of guilt was already resolved, and that this convocation would serve only to draw the mask from the concealed face. In the hours which followed, Holmes contrived with subtle artifice to spread abroad a report that a letter of the late Mr. Harcourt's, hitherto concealed, had come to light. He spoke of it to Mrs. Harcourt in tones calculated to be overheard, and left the servants in no doubt that its existence was both real and significant. The effect was immediate. I observed the cook cross herself when she thought herself unobserved, while the housekeeper whispered to the footman with a furtive glance in our direction. Even the widow herself betrayed a momentary tightening of the lips and a quick, startled movement of the hand, though she recovered swiftly and made no comment. Holmes appeared absorbed in trifles, a book here, a map there, but I knew him well enough to see that each ripple of unease was noted and stored. To my own mind, the tale of the letter seemed but another stratagem to deepen the general disquiet. It was not until later that I comprehended the full ingenuity of the device. By planting the rumour of a revelation, Holmes had baited his snare with the most irresistible of lures, the dread of exposure. Evening came, and with it the strange assembly. The drawing-room, dimly lit, held a company whose diverse expressions spoke more eloquently than words. The butler maintained an outward composure, but his hand shook as he poured water for the widow. The housekeeper's eyes flitted continually toward the writing desk, while the younger maid clutched her apron in visible alarm. Holmes entered last, serene and measured, and took his place with the air of a magistrate presiding over a court, unseen. He offered no immediate explanation, but conversed lightly upon the weather and the improvements of railway travel, as though nothing were amiss. Yet beneath his calm exterior, the atmosphere grew charged, each silence stretching taut as a wire. I, for my part, felt the weight of suspense pressing heavily upon me. It seemed as though each heart in the room beat in anticipation of some disclosure that must surely alter the fate of all. The widow sat rigid, her face pale but controlled, her gaze fixed upon the carpet as though to avoid the scrutiny of Holmes's piercing eyes. Thus we waited, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire, while the unseen drama gathered to its climax. Holmes's gaze rested longest upon Mrs. Harcourt. At the first mention of her late husband's supposed letter, I observed a scarcely perceptible quiver pass across her lips, followed by a sudden stilling of her hands upon her lap. Her composure was admirable, yet to one who watched closely, the mask was not perfect. Holmes, with that subtle courtesy which veils the keenest scrutiny, addressed her upon indifferent subjects, yet every syllable was calculated. She replied evenly, though her eyes never once met his. To me it seemed that the very effort to appear unshaken betrayed the strain beneath. Holmes leaned back at last, and the faintest gleam of triumph touched his features. I knew the moment of revelation approached, though he gave no sign to the company at large. The moments which followed were among the most trying I have known. Holmes, as though content with his evening's experiment, engaged the company in trifling discourse. He spoke of music, of the fashions of London, even of the merits of various tobaccos, his tone light and unhurried. To the uninitiated, he might have seemed a guest whiling away a dull hour. Yet beneath that surface calm, I detected the tense expectancy of the hunter who has laid his snare and awaits the faltering step of the prey. His every casual glance at the desk, where a sealed envelope lay conspicuously, was like the twitch of a line in water. The household, uneasy under the enforced gaiety, replied in monosyllables. Mrs. Harcourt herself sat like a figure carved from stone, her eyes fixed rigidly away from the desk. I could feel the suspense mounting to an almost intolerable pitch, until it seemed the very air must crack beneath the strain. Holmes alone remained untroubled, his calmness the still centre about which our anxieties revolved. He knew, I felt sure, that the guilty would be unable to resist. At last the silence was broken by a movement so slight that another eye might have missed it. Mrs. Harcourt's hand, trembling yet determined, shifted upon her lap. Her gaze flickered once, twice, toward the desk, and then, as Holmes turned the conversation to the supposed letter, she half rose. For a single instant, the mask of composure fell. A look of desperate calculation passed across her features, and her steps, faltering yet resolute, carried her toward the writing desk. Holmes's eyes, bright with the satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled, met mine. Without a word spoken between us, I knew that his snare had drawn tight. The room, hushed and breathless, seemed suspended in that moment, awaiting the revelation that must follow. A profound hush fell upon the drawing-room. The assembled company, uneasy under Holmes's inscrutable gaze, scarcely dared to stir. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the distant ticking of a clock, each stroke marking the suspense that hung in the air. Holmes, seated upright, seemed the very embodiment of composure. His hands, lightly steepled, rested upon his knee, and his eyes moved from face to face with the deliberation of a judge before pronouncing sentence. For myself, I confess that my pulse quickened and my breath came short. I felt instinctively that the moment of revelation had come, that the strange tapestry of hints and tokens would at last be woven into a clear pattern. The widow, seated with outward calm, betrayed by the pallor of her cheek and the faint tightening of her lips, the inward storm that raged within her breast. Holmes rose slowly, his height seeming to dominate the chamber. When he spoke, his tone was calm, almost conversational, yet the import of his words struck like a thunderclap. "Ladies and gentlemen," said he, "you have been gathered here not to unmask a prowler from without, but to confront a deceiver within. The supposed victim of these outrages is none other than their author. Mrs. Harcourt, it is you who have devised this elaborate masquerade." A gasp ran through the company, while the widow sat motionless, her gaze fixed steadily upon Holmes. For an instant her composure was unshaken. She might have been carved from marble. But Holmes continued inexorably. "The notes, the symbols, the cries in the night, all are of your own contrivance, madam, designed to deflect suspicion and to conjure a phantom enemy. In truth, you feared discovery not from strangers, but from the very household which you now so artfully sought to deceive." The words, spoken with such implacable certainty, cast a chill over the room. I could scarce believe that the woman who had appeared so frail and pitiable should be named as the chief architect of our fears. The effect upon the assembly was immediate and extraordinary. The servants stared at one another in open disbelief, some murmuring protests, others falling into stunned silence. The butler's jaw worked soundlessly, while the housekeeper clasped her apron as though to steady herself. Mrs. Harcourt alone retained a mask of composure. She lifted her chin slightly, her eyes cold, her lips set in a thin line of disdain. Yet even in that studied defiance, I perceived the faint tremor of her hand upon the chair arm, the subtle sign of a fortress about to fall. For my own part, I was torn between astonishment and a reluctant recognition of Holmes' accuracy. The clues, trivial when scattered, had pointed in this very direction, once gathered in his relentless logic. Still, the shock of the revelation pressed heavily upon me, and I could scarce take my eyes from the widow's pale face. Holmes, with that quiet authority which brooks no denial, proceeded to strip away the fabric of falsehood with which Mrs. Harcourt had enshrouded herself. "You spoke of footprints beneath your window, madam. Yet their spacing betrayed a stride too regular for stealth. They were impressed not by a man climbing to your casement, but by one walking calmly across the lawn. It was you who directed attention to them, knowing well they proved nothing." He drew from his pocket the ribbon taken from the sundial. This token, tied in a sailor's knot, was meant to suggest some secret hand at work. Yet the freshness of the silk showed it was placed in broad daylight, and by one who knew the ground to be watched. As for the scream in the night, it was too timely, too dramatic. Our pursuit found nothing but trampled grass. A phantom intruder served your purpose better than a real one. His words, precise and deliberate, fell one by one, like strokes of a hammer upon the anvil of truth. The tale of a stalking enemy crumbled under the weight of his reasoning, and all eyes turned again to the widow. Holmes's voice softened, though his gaze remained fixed upon her. "The true key, Mrs. Harcourt, lies not in these theatrics, but in the death of your husband. His passing was too sudden, too little explained. You feared that inquiry might reveal what the physician overlooked, a subtle poison, administered with care, left no outward mark, yet gave you the inheritance you coveted. At this, a collective murmur rose from the listeners. The widow's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. You contrived these terrors, Holmes continued, to direct suspicion away from yourself and to prepare a story of persecution should questions arise. But the letter you feared, the one in which your husband confided his suspicions of your designs, was the phantom that haunted you most. You staged a drama to conceal a crime, yet the very excess of your efforts has betrayed you. I confess my heart sank as the awful picture unfolded. That this woman, so seemingly crushed by grief, should in truth have been the hand that wrought her husband's death, filled me with a sense of sorrow deeper even than anger. Nor, Holmes went on, was the choice of colour accidental. The green gown in which you presented yourself, the ribbons, the notes marked with that word, all were but variations upon a theme. They served to weave a legend of some malicious figure, while in truth they reflected your own obsession. Green, madam, is the hue of the emerald feud which clouded your family's history. You feared that old quarrel might re-emerge, linking your name with disputes over jewels and inheritance. By draping your tale in green, you hoped to mislead us into thinking the menace sprang from that ancient quarrel. In reality, it was no feud, but your own avarice that drove these events. The explanation, given with Holmes's customary precision, seemed to strike the final chord. The company, who had listened spellbound, now shifted uneasily, as the last veil was torn away. For myself, I marvelled anew at the subtlety of his perception. What I had dismissed as a woman's whim of dress or decoration was revealed as a deliberate stratagem in the service of guilt. It was then that the fortress of her composure gave way. With a strangled cry, she rose, her eyes blazing with a fury born of despair. "Yes," she cried, "yes, it is true. He would have ruined me, cast me aside, stripped me of all. I would not be the slave of his whims. I struck before he could strike." The words poured from her lips in a torrent, mingled with sobs and wild gestures. She tore at the green silk of her gown, as though to rid herself of its accusing hue. The servants shrank back in horror, while Holmes stood unmoved, his calm face the very antithesis of her frenzy. At last, exhausted, she sank into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Her confession lay before us, undeniable and complete. A heavy silence followed, broken only by her broken weeping. To me it was the most tragic of spectacles, a woman undone not by the hand of justice, but by the weight of her own conscience, compelled to speak by the irresistible force of truth. Holmes, grave and composed, gave a slight inclination of his head, as though acknowledging the inevitable close of the drama. Our return to London was marked by a silence more profound than any words could convey. The tumult at Harcourt Grange, with its storm of passions and confessions, seemed already to belong to some dreamlike past. Yet the quiet familiarity of Baker Street, with its fireglow and the ticking of the old clock, threw into sharper relief the tragedy we had witnessed. Holmes, for his part, was the picture of serenity. He seated himself in his armchair, lit his pipe with habitual deliberation, and seemed content to let the smoke curl upward in silent testimony to his thoughts. I, however, was restless. The image of the stricken widow haunted me, mingled with the horror of her confession. At length I turned to Holmes with the question that pressed upon me. "You must explain, Holmes. How came you to pierce the veil when all others were blinded?" Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed, and spoke in that deliberate tone which was his habit when reconstructing a case. "From the first, Watson, I was struck less by what the widow told us than by what she avoided. You will recall that when I inquired into her husband's illness, she supplied details so vague as to be useless. A heaviness of the chest, a sudden collapse, all terms which convey nothing to a physician's mind. A true account, however brief, bears the impress of reality. Hers was but a recital rehearsed. I protested that grief might excuse her faltering. "Not so," Holmes replied firmly. "Even the most bereaved spouse recalls the hour of death with painful exactitude. It was her very generality that betrayed her. Moreover, each time the matter of medicine or cause was raised, she grew palpably uneasy. That unease, Watson, was not of grief, but of guilt. From that moment, I resolved to test her tale against the facts, and the cracks widened at every turn." Holmes continued, his voice calm but edged with quiet irony. "Consider the colour green, which recurred with such insistence. A ribbon tied to a sundial, a gown ill-suited to mourning, a note pinned with a knife, all designed to suggest an external persecutor. Yet the very theatricality of the device betrayed its origin. An enemy bent upon secrecy does not advertise himself with emblems. He strikes unseen. Only one who sought to mislead, not to hide, would employ so flamboyant a signal." He drew from his pocket the strip of silk taken from the garden. "Note the freshness of the knot. It was tied not under cover of darkness, but in broad daylight, when she herself could accomplish it. To invent a phantom, Watson, she had recourse to colour and symbol. But to the trained eye, each artifice was but another proof of design. The theatre of green was her stage, and she the playwright. I listened with growing awe, perceiving how what had seemed uncanny tokens of pursuit were, in truth, the crude props of her deception." Holmes smiled faintly as he went on. "The scream in the night, Watson. Surely you recall its timing. It was raised at the very moment when the storm drowned all other sounds. Convenient, was it not, that the supposed intruder left no trace save the trampled grass we ourselves made in pursuit? She had but to fling open the window, utter her cry, and point to the darkness. The storm performed the rest." He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. "A genuine intruder leaves some evidence, a footprint, a shadow, a broken branch. In this case there was only her word, and her word, I had already learned, was the least reliable witness. I confess that the recollection stung, for I had been among the first to accept her tale of terror without question." Holmes next turned to the question of the missing pendant. Here, Watson, was the clearest token of all. The jade ornament was kept in a locked cabinet, of which only the widow had both knowledge and access. Yet she declared with vehemence that it was stolen by her phantom intruder. How, pray, could a prowler divine its hiding place unless he were furnished with her own knowledge? The theft was the one note too many in her discordant performance. It proclaimed her guilt more loudly than silence ever could. He rose, paced to the mantelpiece, and tapped the pipe against the grate. It is the common error of the guilty to overplay their part. Had she refrained from the pendant's disappearance, her tale of persecution might have won her sympathy yet a while. But avarice, which drove her crime, also betrayed it. As he spoke, I recalled her anguished cry at the discovery. It had rung with such sincerity that I, in my blindness, had felt nothing but pity. To Holmes, it had been the false note of an actress too skilled for her own safety. Here, I broke in with a confession of my own. "Holmes, I must own that I was blinded by compassion. Her pallor, her trembling hands, her mournful dignity, all appealed so strongly to one's chivalry that I could not doubt her word. My heart, I fear, rebelled against my reason." He inclined his head gravely. "It is no reproach to you, Watson. Indeed, your very trust in appearances is what renders your companionship so valuable. You stand as the measure of the ordinary mind, swayed by sympathy, deceived by semblance, yet honest in its error. Without you, I should lose the very contrast by which truth is made manifest." His words, though kindly meant, deepened my reflection. I realized then how easily the human heart may be ensnared, and how necessary was Holmes's cold and luminous logic to guard against such snares. At length Holmes rose, knocked the ashes from his pipe, and turned to me with that faint smile which so often heralded the close of a case. Thus, Watson, you perceive how deception may flourish so long as it is cloaked in drama, but falters the instant it is weighed against fact. The play is compelling while the curtain is drawn, yet the daylight of reason reveals the painted scenery for what it is. He resumed his chair, folding his hands in quiet repose. Our widow wove her tale with cunning, but in the end her own artifices betrayed her. Truth, however obscured, has the sturdier fibre. I made no reply, for the fire burned low, and my thoughts were dark with pity for a woman whose grief had been but a mask. Holmes sat silent, the smoke wreathing about him like a veil, his calm unbroken, his triumph complete. Once more we found ourselves within the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street. The tumult of Harcourt Grange seemed to belong to another world as we sat in our accustomed places, the fire burning steadily and the air fragrant with the smoke of Holmes's pipe. The storm, the cries, the dramatic confession, all were now subdued into memory by the quiet order of our chambers. Holmes, sunk deep into his armchair, allowed the smoke to rise in curling wreaths about his head, his gaze distant yet composed. He was the very picture of calm after tempest, a man who had faced the storm of human passion and emerged unshaken. I, for my part, felt the weight of the case still pressing upon me. The tragic figure of the widow haunted my thoughts, and I awaited Holmes's reflections with the eagerness of one seeking both enlightenment and solace. "It is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes began, "that guilt proclaims itself less by what a person does than by what they strive to conceal. The innocent speak with precision, for they have nothing to fear. The guilty, however, hedge their statements, generalize and avoid particulars, for each detail threatens to betray them. Mrs. Harcourt's narrative was a perfect illustration. She faltered when speaking of her husband's illness, cloaked the facts in vagueness, and shrank from every direct inquiry. He leaned forward, the firelight gleaming upon his keen features. Human behaviour is a tapestry, and though one may disguise the pattern, there will always remain a loose thread. The anxious gesture, the hastily averted glance, the over-elaborate denial, these are the signs more damning than blood upon a sleeve, for conscience, however hardened, still whispers, and the body betrays what the lips would deny. I listened, struck anew by the ease with which Holmes discerned truth from the subtlest of inconsistencies. To me, the widow's faltering voice had inspired compassion. To him, it had rung with the dissonance of guilt. Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe before continuing. "You remarked often upon the prevalence of green in this affair. To you, it seemed mere coincidence of ribbon, gown, and word. Yet colour itself may be the language of the mind. Green has long been emblematic of envy and of greed, the twin poisons which corrode the soul." Mrs. Harcourt, in her fixation, clothed her deceit in the very symbol of her motive. Consider, she inherited wealth through her crime, yet her conscience compelled her to stage a phantom menace. And what emblem did she choose to mark her work? Green, the shade of her quarrel over emeralds, the hue of her avarice, the pallor of her corroded spirit. It was no accident, Watson, but the unconscious confession of a guilty mind. His words impressed me deeply. I saw in that colour, once merely decorative, a symbol of the soul's corruption, subtle yet unmistakable. Holmes turned his gaze upon me with that half-smile which tempered his severity. "You, my dear Watson, viewed the widow with sympathy, and therein lies your strength and your peril. Sympathy ennobles man, yet it blinds him. It is the common failing of honest hearts to measure others by their own sincerity. Thus you were deceived, as many might be, by her trembling hands and mournful eyes. I admitted, with some shame, that my compassion had outweighed my judgment. Do not regret it," Holmes replied gently. "It is precisely because you feel where I do not that our partnership endures. Yet remember, evil often cloaks itself in the garb of suffering. It thrives upon pity as much as upon ignorance. To reason clearly, one must balance the heart's warmth with the mind's cold discernment. Sympathy without scrutiny is the open door through which deceit enters. His words, though spoken without reproach, left their mark upon me, and I resolved to guard my heart with greater vigilance in the future. Holmes settled back once more, the glow of the fire outlining his profile. Mark II, Watson, how secrecy poisons where open enmity might have healed. Had Mr. Harcourt confided in his friends, or had his wife confessed her fears, the tragedy might have been averted. But silence, that most insidious of companions, fostered suspicion, greed, and ultimately crime. The Harcourt household was steeped in unspoken matters, and thus the seeds of ruin found ready soil. I pondered his words, perceiving their justice. Truly, it was not open hostility, but hidden passions, festering in silence, that had wrought destruction in that unhappy home. As I lay down my pen upon this record, I cannot banish from my mind the vision of Eleanor Harcourt, once a figure of grace and sorrow, revealed at last as the perpetrator of a crime most foul. It is a bitter truth that evil so often wears the mask of suffering, and that the pity of honest men may be turned into the very shield of guilt. I reflected, too, upon the frailty of human nature, how love may curdle into jealousy, wealth into temptation, and pride into ruin. Holmes, with his cold, incisive logic, had stripped away the veils. But for myself, I could not wholly silence the pang of compassion for a woman destroyed as much by her own obsession as by her deed. Thus ended the case of the widow in green, a sombre reminder that beneath the trappings of grief may lurk envy, and behind the semblance of innocence, the shadow of sin. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "it is not always the hand that strikes which reveals the crime, but the mind that dresses falsehood in too much colour. Guilt, when desperate, becomes theatrical, and therein lies its undoing." I pondered his words, reflecting on how the widow's own devices had betrayed her. But let me ask you, what do you think was her greatest mistake? The poison itself, or the elaborate theatre of green she wove around it? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed unravelling this mystery, do subscribe for more tales of deduction and share this story with friends who love a good puzzle. Until next time, the game, as ever, is afoot.